Thank you very much, Tiffany. Thank you, Wally. Thank you, Cricket Australia, for the great honour of inviting me to be the 11th Bradman Orator. In a distinguished lineup, there are those who would say it's the most appropriate position for me in the batting order, though I reckon I might get in ahead of Tim Rice. It's an honour, but it's an intimidating honour. And actually, it's a very intimidating, it's very bright here, I can't see you. But I assume you're all out there still. Following Rahul Dravid, for one thing, who himself said it made him more nervous than going to bat at number 3 at the MCG. And for another thing, it's not a talk you invite us for. It's not a mere lecture or even a speech. It's an oration, no less than an oration, which is an imposing word and an imposing task. It's not only an oration, but it's a Bradman oration. And thank you, John, too. Somewhere over here, but I can't actually see you. There he is. Which is equally imposing. I mean, the greatest batsman the world has ever known, a tireless administrator, and a man whose words were shrewd and often moving. It's just possible that the names Bradman and Brearley are not indissolubly linked in the minds of cricket lovers, except perhaps for those who study the alphabetical order of England, Australian Test players, in which we are separated only by Len Braund, who played 23 Tests for England in the first decade of the 20th century. A heckler in Sydney did once link Bradman and me during the 4th Test of 1978-9. Brearley, he shouted, "You make Dinesh look like Bradman." However, I've got one Test batting statistic that makes me superior to Don Bradman. I dare say many of you don't know a fact that's hard to believe, but of Don Bradman's 80 Test innings, no fewer than 10 ended in ducks. Once in 8 times, Don Bradman went to the crease in a Test match, he was out for naught. That's a remarkable fact. Whereas in my Test career, in 66 innings, only 6 were ducks. I met Sir Donald a few times on my tours of Australia. Doug Insall, Ken Barrington, Bob Willis and I had lunch with him in Adelaide, and I liked him. He was spry, quick, trenchant, and very modest. He had a twinkle in his eye. I remember best the discussion we had about fast bowlers. He reckoned that for about 18 months, Frank Tyson was the quickest he'd seen, and that Harold Larwood was quicker than the bowlers of that day, who included, don't forget, Michael Holding, Andy Roberts, Dennis Lilly, and Jeff Thompson. No slouches. He acknowledged that Rodney Hogg was, as he put it, a bit slippery. I thought Rodney was a bit slippery too. I come to Australia, as you'll appreciate, at a good time for English cricket, and at a key moment, I suspect, for Australian cricket. We're between these 2 Test Ashes series, unusually close together. As you may have noticed, England have won 4 of the last 5 series, though far be it from me to try and rub that in. Australians, I gather, are baffled and confused by this scenario, one matched by parallel difficulties in other sports. It must be a time of soul-searching, and I look forward very much to the upcoming series. So what to talk to you about, what to orate on? There are so many possible current topics: Test cricket and the threat of T20 domestic leagues, umpire review systems, including the hotspot of hotspot, how to fight corruption in sport, and in particular in cricket, and so on. But you may be a little tired of these issues, some of which will no doubt come up in the panel, and I'm not sure I've got anything very original to say on them. So I've decided to talk about something that borders on the work I've been doing as a psychoanalyst for the last 30 years, since stopping playing cricket. I'd like to consider the question, what is the point of sport and in particular of cricket? And how does this link with the Ashes? So, what is the point of it? Here are two quotes. First, nothing in cricket has the slightest importance when set against a single death from violence in Northern Ireland. Obviously, a quote from the time of the Troubles. And second, some people believe football is a matter of life and death. I'm very disappointed with that attitude. I can assure you it's much, much more important than that. Now, the first quote was from John Arlott, and the second was Bill Shankly, the manager of Liverpool Football Club. What are we to make of this apparent conflict? For those to whom sport doesn't appeal, it does seem futile, pointless. They remember hours of misery at compulsory school games on cold, or indeed, no doubt, hot sporting fields. They were perhaps physically awkward and picked last, and one can understand what a torment all this must have been for many people. Yet, before self-doubt and comparison with other people, other children, gets a grip, every small child takes pleasure in his or her bodily capacities and adroitness. Gradually, the child achieves a measure of physical coordination and mastery. Walking, jumping, dancing, catching, kicking, climbing, splashing, using an implement as a bat or a racket, all these offer a sense of achievement and satisfaction. Sport grows out of pleasure in such activities. Moreover, this development in coordination is part of the development of a more unified self. Instead of being subject, as we are as babies, to more or less random stimulus-response movements, we learn to act in the world according to central intentions or trajectories. We begin to know what we're doing and what we're about. The small child gradually finds a degree of rhythm and control through and in its movements, and there's the pleasure of improving. So far, dance and sport would be barely distinguishable. Sport proper starts to emerge when competition with others plays a more central role alongside the simple delights in physicality. I can run faster than you, climb higher, wrestle you to the floor. Aggression enters in more obviously to combine with the flamboyance that's already in place. Sport's an area where aggression and the public demonstration of skills and of character are permitted and encouraged. For many people otherwise inclined to be inhibited or self-conscious, sport offers a unique opportunity for self-expression and spontaneity. Within a framework of rules and acceptable behavior, sports people can be wholehearted. Such people, including me, owe sport a lot. Here we begin to find ourselves, to become the selves we have the potential to be. In this process, the child and the adult have to learn to cope with the emotional ups and downs of victory and defeat, success and failure. We, gradually manage to keep going against the odds, to struggle back to form, to recognize the risks of complacency. We have to learn to deal with inner voices telling us we're no good, and with voices telling us we're wonderful. In sport, the tendency is to triumph when we do well, and to become angry or depressed when we do badly are often strong, and we have to find our own ways of coping with them. Arrogance and humiliation have to be struggled against, whilst determination, proper pride, and good sportsmanship are struggled towards. Spectators identify not only with the skills of sportsmen, but also with their characters, their characteristic ways of facing those twin imposters, success and failure. These scenarios are central dramas of sport. Sport calls too for a subtle balancing of planning and spontaneity, of calculation and letting go, of discipline and freedom. Greg Chappell wrote an email to me some years ago in which he said, premeditation is the graveyard of batting. This is importantly true, though it needs some qualification or expansion, which of course Greg would give and probably will give in a while. but for two reasons. One is that we need to set ourselves in certain ways. A batsman playing in a T20 match has a totally different orientation to the task from a player in a test match. In the one context, he's looking to score off every ball, is aware of the pressures of time and of the urgent need to evaluate quickly where his side should be in 2 overs or 5 overs time. And second, the advice may in some cases be a counsel of perfection, aimed at a highly skilled player and geared to a scenario in which there's infinite time. All batsmen have to do some premeditation, if only in ruling out certain options. Even that mercurial genius Dennis Compton looked to be on the back foot when facing quick bowlers. Most players pre-decide whether to go for the hook or alternatively to defend or evade the short pitch ball. They adopt a policy. In that sense, they premeditate. In shorter games, all batsmen predetermine, or at least have a range of possibilities in their minds. Also, one has to train oneself in the sporting skills, form a reliable technique, and work at it. But I think this is Greg's point. Having disciplined ourselves, having set ourselves according to the situation of the game, we then have to let ourselves go, trusting to our craftsmanship, skill, and intuitive responsiveness, without further interference from the conscious mind. Occasionally, this leads to that sublime balance between elements that constitutes being in the zone or being on form. At the peak of performance, one's simultaneously alert to possible lines of attack by individual and collective opponents and able to respond with more or less uncluttered minds to the next play or assault. Like parents with children, we have a complicated job to do in enabling our own selves to find the right balance between self-discipline and free rein. The moments when body and mind are at one, when we're completely concentrated and completely relaxed, aware of every relevant detail of the surroundings, but not obsessed or hypersensitive to any set of them, confident without being overconfident, aware of dangers without being overcautious. Such rare states of mind are akin to being in love. They involve a marriage between the conscious control mentioned above, with the allowing of a more unconscious creativity through the body's knowledge. In such states, the role of the conscious mind is, as Greg says, to stand back and quietly watch. Sport divides, of course, into team games and individual games. One of the aims of team sports is for a group of individuals to be transfigured from a collection into a team, from a group functioning either like a homogeneous flock or as a bunch of disparate individualists into a team with a range of differentiated roles, with room for individual expression, which has to be kept subservient to the cohesion of the whole team. Team sport calls for this balancing of self-interest and group interest. The members of the team have at times to constrain themselves in the interest of the team, and they also have the benefit of the team's support, especially when things are not going well. Cricket's unusual. Like baseball, but unlike golf or football, it's a matter of individual contests and dramas within a team context. When Chris Rogers, presumably, opens the batting against Jimmy Anderson of Brisbane in a month's time, he'll be well aware that what happens next is up to him and Anderson, but their battle will also, at some more subliminal level, be influenced by the morale of the two teams, and that will be more so as the series goes on. As Don Bradman said about the Invincibles, the 1948 side touring England, nothing can alter the figures which will appear in black and white in the record books, but they cannot record the spirit which permeated the side, the courage and fighting qualities of the players, for these things can't be measured. They were on a very high plane. Unlike baseball, though, and it's like baseball in that, what I've just said, cricket's contests between bat and ball can last for very long time periods, days even, and go through many ups and downs. A weather vane in the shape of Father Time surveys Lords, as symbolizing perhaps both the fact that time brings everything to an end and the timelessness of the experience of watching and playing cricket. I mean, it can be so timeless to be very boring, but I'm not talking about that. Cricket is unique in its potential for drawn-out struggles between two people, two protagonists, each with his or her powerful narcissistic wishes for admiration and fears of humiliation, all within this team context. And for the batsman, failure means a symbolic death. He or she has to leave the arena, a king deposed. Team games give people a sense of belonging and a proper pride. And this can happen not only on the small scale of a single team, but on a national scale. Sport may be the one place where a country can come together with good feeling about itself. This has happened, I think, through cricket in Afghanistan, whose national team have worked their way up from Division 5 in the World Cricket League in 2008 to be qualifiers for the next World Cup here in 2015. Imagine what this means to a country devastated by wars, corruption, and poverty. If human beings were not combative, no one would have invented sport. But if human beings were not also cooperative, neither team nor individual games would have come into existence. For reasons that I'll come to, rivalry can, and I would say should, be taken close to the limit. But alongside this, cricket also involves the recognition of the unspoken realities of the spirit, respect, and generosity of the game. This is not merely a matter of obedience to the laws. It involves ordinary civilities that oil the wheels of relationships and collegial activities. It involves recognition of limits. It involves consideration and respect, and give and take through a kind of dialogic interplay on the field. The Latin derivation of both rival and compete reflect this. Rival, rivalis in Latin, means sharing the same stream or riverbank, and competens means striving together with, agreeing together, as in competent as well as in competition. Rivalry does not entail lack of respect for one's opponent, obviously, whatever the outcome. Test cricket is, like many other forms of sport, rightly a tough business. But there's another side of these tough contests which can too easily be forgotten, and that's the fair-mindedness and sportsmanship between hard, high-powered competitors. One such occurred in the last innings of the centenary test in 1977, when Derek Randall made his fantastic 174 and Dennis Lillee took 11 wickets in the match. And the result, you'll remember, was precisely the same as the result of the original match 100 years before, a victory for Australia by 45 runs. At this point on the last day, Randall was well past 100. He might even have got 150. England was something like 250 for two. Lillee was tired, and there was a serious possibility of us winning against all the odds, needing, I think, 417. Greg, the captain, was bowling, and a ball squeezed through between Randall's bat and pad. The batsman, Rod Marsh dived forward to take the ball. The batsman was given out. Picking himself up, Rod indicated to Greg that the ball hadn't carried, and Randall was called back. And the other example was in 2005, the celebrated one when England won at Edgbaston by 2 runs, and Andrew Flintoff, at the very moment of victory, which seems to me to be quite a thing to do, left the team huddle and put his arm around the defeated opponent, Brett Lee. And he was not only commiserating with the pain of defeat, a boot that could so easily have been on the other foot, he was also, I think, acknowledging the kinship between rivals. For at the same time as wanting to defeat our opponents, we depend on them and on their skill, courage, and hostility in order to prove and improve our own skills to earn and merit our pride. There's a unity of shared striving as well as a duality of opposition. 11 players on each team, of course, form bonds through their shared skills and teamwork that are sometimes hard to replicate in the less intense working relationships of everyday life. And that's seen, of course, in after wars when soldiers go back home and find ordinary life very hard to cope with. But it's something similar between the 22 players in a test match who've gone through it together in a way that no spectator does. Envy and jealousy can play a part in, and not always easily accommodated within, ordinary rivalry. In one English county match, Dickie Dodds, the Essex opening batsman, was out without scoring on a pitch that was perfect for batting. Essex went on to dominate the morning session. By lunch had scored 150 without further loss. Having had to watch his team's success from the pavilion, Dodds came up to Doug Insall, one of the not-out batsmen, and said, "Skipper, I hope you haven't been troubled by any bad vibes this morning." And Insall replied breezily, "I can't say I have, Dickie. I've been too busy enjoying myself." "Why do you ask?" "Because," Dickie said, "I've been so full of bitterness, I've not been wishing you well." Now, here's an understandable and very human envy with frankness and regret, which meant, I think, there's no chance of spoiling the relationship. In 1976-7, before the centenary test, I was fortunate enough to play in 5 tests in India. And one of India's formidable quartet of spin bowlers was Eripalli Prasanna, the off-spinner. He was a short, somewhat rotund man with large expressive eyes and a wonderful control of flight. For some reason, he and I would engage in a kind of eye play. His look would say, "Okay, you played that one all right, but where will the next one land?" And mine would reply, "Yes, you fooled me a little, but I notice I adjusted well enough." And he had that peculiarly Indian, minimal, sideways waggle of the head, which suggests that the vertebrae of the subcontinental neck are more loosely linked than our stiffer Western ones. And this waggle joined with the eyes in saying, "I acknowledge your qualities, and I know you acknowledge mine." I found it easier to enter into this kind of an engagement with a slow bowler who might bamboozle me and get me out, but wasn't at the same time trying to kill me. But I had something similar with some fast bowlers, especially when we were more or less on an equal footing. And with them I could actually enjoy the best ball, pitching on a perfect length, in line with the off stump, moving away. And I also enjoyed the fact, of course, that I wasn't good enough to get an edge to it. But there was the same sort of friendly rivalry. But how much do we really, as sportsmen, desire to be tested? Oh, this is true in life as well. If the opposition's best fast bowler treads on the ball before the start of a test match, as Glenn McGrath did just before the Edgbaston match I referred to before, and can't play, is one relieved or disappointed? Well, there's no escaping the relief. We all want an easier ride, and it would be easier to be hypocritical, falsely high-minded, and say insincerely that we regret that the opposition team has been hampered. But at the same time, there is also a wish in the participants as well as amongst spectators for the contest to be fought with each side at its best, not depleted, so that no one can cavil at victory or make excuses for defeat. Similarly, one might take more pleasure in scoring 50 against Lilly and Thompson than in making 100 against lesser bowling. And Bradman made a parallel point. There's not much personal satisfaction, he said, in making 100 and being missed several times. Any artist must surely aim at perfection. And I would add that perfection includes competing with the best, and this offers the opportunity to feel most fully alive and to find the greatest satisfaction at the time and in retrospect. Opponents challenge us. If we're up to it, they stretch us. They call forth our courage, our skill, and resourcefulness. They force us to develop our techniques or else to lag behind. They're co-creators of excellence and integrity. As the old Yorkshire and England batsman Maurice Leyland once said, "Fast bowling keeps you honest." And the mountaineer Heinrich Harrer wrote, "The glorious thing about mountains is that they will endure no lies." And this is one central reason why corruption, the fixing of any kind, goes against the essence of sport and is the greatest threat to its integrity. Visceral truthfulness is part of the process whereby we come to accept the urgency of our own subjectivity whilst giving room to the subjectivity of the other. It takes courage to risk all in such competitiveness, and courage and generosity to accept the outcome without retreat or revenge. You'll agree that this is part of the appeal of the Ashes. Competitiveness can, of course, get out of hand. It can turn into cheating or into a nasty vindictiveness. Overvaluation of competitiveness can crush and inhibit the growing child. It can spoil relationships and reduce love to trophy seeking. It can result in an attitude of the devil take the hindmost. There is, I think, no need for sledging in sport, and I encountered hardly any of it in my time as a professional cricketer. In my experience, the great West Indian fast bowlers said nothing to the batsmen on the field. One might say they had no need to, first because of their superlative ability, but second because they were quite able to convey menace by eye contact and strut. It happened that when I played my first test match against the West Indies in 1976, both teams were staying in the same hotel in Nottingham, and I ran into Andy Roberts at breakfast. And he gave me a quizzical little look, not crudely unpleasant, but conveying, I felt, something along the lines, "Shall I be having you for breakfast or for tea?" He gave these looks on the field too, like the face of Helen of Troy, which launched 1,000 ships and is conveyed 1,000 words. There are differences that would be hard to define between appropriate shrewdness in undermining an opponent and sledging, a boorish expression of contempt. Cricket is, after all, not only a physical game. It includes bluff, menace, ploy, and counterploy. Setting a field is not simply a matter of putting someone where the ball is most likely to go, though that's not a bad idea. Have modern captains forgotten about third man? But also of making the batsman wonder what's coming next, or making clear to him that we reckon he lacks certain strokes. The aim is that he'll be undone by such a statement, which into a loss of nerve or into reckless attempts to prove us wrong. Words may enter into this. A captain might say, within a batsman's hearing, "You don't need anyone back there for him." And I'd be inclined to see this as a fair enough nibble at the batsman's state of mind. Viv Richards' swagger at the crease and Shane Warne's slow, mesmerizing 9-step walk, which took up most of his so-called run-up, were key elements in their unequivocal assertion that this was their stage, a stage their opponents had little right to share with them. Such attitudes by captains as well as by bowlers or batsmen seem to me to be acceptable, even admirable, but they can tip over into arrogance and superiority, or even into a sort of gang warfare. The line is thin. Superiority and arrogance, they may be endemic in a person or a culture. The British Empire was not exactly free of them, as you may have noticed. We British have many terms of abuse or disparagement for members of other cultures, racist stereotyping. What was remarkable about the rise of West Indian cricket, a rise that culminated in their extraordinary period of dominance during the 70s and 80s and early 90s, before you had yours, is that people who had been enslaved and then released into a world of prejudice, arrogance, and power, with many of these arrangements extending into cricket, should have been so open to values that they found in this strange colonial game. Self-disparagement is one consequence of racial and other kinds of trauma, yet cricketers like LeBrun and Leary Constantine, father and son, George Headley, Frank Worrell, were able through their exploits and attitudes to build up the self-respect of their fellows so that later generations could be stronger, more determined, more in touch with their proper pride. It seems to me that West Indians of the earlier generations were able to be modest in the sense of knowing they had a lot to learn, without being abject, and proud without being arrogant. They were prepared to celebrate the glass as half full, rather than rage against its being half empty. They were willing also to wait. It was thanks to their pride and forbearance that the next generation, Roberts and Richards included, could triumph so memorably in what was able to be by then healthy competition between true equals. So competitiveness can turn into bullying, uncouthness, or superiority, but it can also be perverted in the opposite direction. Some people refrain from competing wholeheartedly because they're afraid of winning and even avoid doing so. One young boy desperately wanted to win the first board game with his father, but then equally desperately needed to lose the second, so that neither party would lose face or have to bear too much disappointment or have to deal with any tendency to gloat. One might think loftily that a mature attitude to winning in sport is not to mind. To my mind, the opposite is true. Not minding often means avoiding really trying. I'm aware, of course, that recreational sport played for fun may have other aims and values. Of one social side captain, it was said that his captaincy had twin aims: to give every player a good game and to beat the opposition as narrowly as possible. And I can see the point in this. But something is also lost in such an attitude. In sport, we have the opportunity and the license to assert ourselves as separate and authentic individuals against others who have the same license. This potential allows us to find our own unique identity whilst respecting that of others. And this is part of the wider growth of the personality, of which one aspect would be the Quaker capacity to tell truth to power. One element in telling the truth is being able to stand firm against powerful and sometimes bullying forces without becoming a bully oneself. The more strenuous and spirited aspects of competitiveness enhance self-development, courage, and sheer exhilaration. They can also be the occasion and source of the discovery and growth of new methods and techniques, whereas being less than wholehearted is liable to be, though it may not be, a kind of evasion or cowardice. I was once a guest player in an English professional side on a short tour involving a number of matches. And during the first half of that tour, we tried our best, but lost more than we won. We'd been facing talented players in their conditions. The matches were played hard, even though they were not part of any ongoing competitive league or series. In the next game, against a very powerful side, we were led by the newly arrived captain. This captain preferred to emphasize the entertainment value in the game. Being a supposedly friendly fixture and not wanting to be too serious, he took off his frontline bowlers, allowing the opposition to display their most powerful strokes. They scored an even bigger total than they would have done without his, to my mind, misguided generosity. They bowled flat out against us, and we limped to a crushing defeat. This gesture of giving runs patronized the other team and robbed each party of the satisfaction of doing their best in striving properly to win. We didn't properly lose, although we did lose face, and the guilt on the opposition's win was tarnished. Such dilution of proper rivalry can also occur out of a wish to look good. One Test captain, whom I won't name, decided during the afternoon of the last day that his batsmen should play for a draw rather than take further risks in going for a win, a perfectly respectable decision. He was, however, reluctant to be criticised for being a defensive captain. And this match happened to be the first test for a young batsman in the middle order who'd been given out incorrectly for a duck in the first innings and had been given a hard time by the crowd who'd wanted their local hero selected instead of him. When he went into bat that last afternoon, the captain gave him the following orders: play for a draw, but don't make it look as if we're playing for a draw. Now, to my mind, this was hypocritical and cowardly captaincy. The debutant was in a difficult enough place without having to act a false role on top of trying to bat. And the captain was more interested in how he himself looked than in competing properly or in supporting a young player. I even have some doubts about what was, from one viewpoint, a notable example of nobility and generosity. The great Surrey and England batsman Jack Hobbs once said that as Surrey had a lot of good batsmen and the oval pitch was usually easy, when he and Andy Sandham had put on 150 or so for the first wicket, he'd sometimes give his wicket to the most deserving professional bowler. And when the pitch was difficult or Larwood and Vose were playing, that was when he really earned his money, he went on to say. But in making a gift of his wicket, did Hobbs belittle the recipient of the gift, who'd not by his own skill and persistence forced an error? Did he treat the bowler not man to man, but man to boy? Was there an element of the feudal in this largesse? When England were about to tour India, that tour I mentioned before in 1976, some of us took the opportunity to ask Len Hutton, as you know, a Yorkshireman noted for his dry, enigmatic comments, for advice. And Len appeared characteristically guarded. He then uttered a single short sentence: "Don't take pity on them Indian bowlers." And actually that was the same occasion on which Tony Greig asked him for some advice, having just captained against the West Indies and come out with his famous remark about making them grovel. And Len's response to Tony was, "Don't say too much." In the great battles of sport, no quarter is given and none expected. Some of you may remember the contest between South African fast bowler Alan Donald and Michael Atherton at Trent Bridge in 1998. A great fast bowler hurled all his aggression, power and skill at a defiant and gritty batsman, a battle given an extra tinge of menace by the umpiring mistake, as a result of which Atherton had just been given not out, having got a fairly thick glove on one from Donald. There are occasions when observers tremble with awe. In 1974-5, which you will remember or know about, when there was Lillian Thompson and some fairly sporting pitches here in Australia, it was the first time that there were broadcasts of highlights in England of Test matches in Australia. And they came on after the ITV News at 10:30 in the evening. And my Middlesex colleague, who was an opening batsman like me, Mike Smith, reported pouring himself large gin and tonic and sitting behind the sofa to watch the action, with the ice clinking in his glass. Now, in that series, Tony Greig used to provoke Dennis. He believed that Dennis bowled less well the more fired up he got, and Tony himself reacted at his best when an opponent was incensed. And that was pretty courageous. And I realised that I've mentioned both Mike Dennis and Tony Greig, my immediate predecessors as captain of England, both of whom died sadly in the last year. And I just wanted to mention that as I'd mentioned them both. And it's a very sad fact of life. Some of the most memorable contests are those where the aggression is raw but contained, perhaps only just, within the bounds of respect for the opposition and for the rules and traditions of the game. And one of the great things about Ashes matches is the absolute commitment of both sides. So, to return briefly to John Arlott and Bill Shankly. Arlott's clearly right about particular moments, death or serious injury, or real tragedies or disasters, compared with which a low score, even a Don Bradman duck, is nothing. On the other hand, the institution of sport, with its challenges and opportunities, its companionship with teammates and opponents alike, offers a setting for activities that enrich life, that build character, and that help develop the complex balance between being an individual and being part of a group or a team. Both are right. Thank you very much.